For this episode of Scholar Talks, the guiding question is, how did John Dickinson consistently support Republican ideals during the American Revolution and founding? Our guest, Jane Calvert, is the founding director and chief editor of the John Dickinson Writings Project. She's the author of Quaker Constitutionalism and the Political Thought of John Dickinson. And her latest book is The Penman of the Founding, a Biography of John Dickinson, which is today's topic. And incidentally, a prize-winning book already. It won the James Kirby Martin History Prize and is a finalist for the illustrious George Washington Book Prize. I am Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Scholar Talks in our America 250 series. Jane, I want to thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
Great. I love the book, John Dickinson, one of my favorite founders. Thought I knew him, had read some other books, and then I go and read yours, and it's the standard. It's already, in my mind, the standard and definitive biography of Dickinson. You obviously know Dickinson really well, and so I hope you win all the prizes.
No, that's so nice. Thank you so much.
So let's jump into the questions. There's so much to talk about with Dickinson. And so he may fall under the heading of a forgotten founder. And so can you please briefly describe, provide us with a little bit of background about him to get started and maybe a little bit about the genesis of this book?
Sure. Well, so Dickinson was, I think that's right, that he is a forgotten founder. But crucially, in his day, he was America's first celebrity. Everybody knew his name, especially his pen name, which was the Pennsylvania Farmer. And he was the leading legal mind of his time. He wrote more documents for the founding than any other person. He held more public offices. He engaged more with ordinary Americans and brought them into the discussion. He was really the most central individual throughout the founding period, from the Stamp Act crisis in 1765 all the way through the early 1790s, and then even as a private citizen after his retirement until his death in 1808. But the reason we don't know about him today, there are a couple reasons. One is that early 19th century historians sort of just glommed on to his refusal to vote on or sign the Declaration of Independence and cast him as a villain, opposed to sort of the hero John Adams. And so that was one thing. And then subsequent historians, they didn't dig deeper, but one of the reasons is that they couldn't, because Dickinson's entire corpus of papers, his writings, his correspondence, his legal notes, all that stuff, that had never been published or collected and published. And so the reason we have so many books, biographies, and studies of all of the other founders is because for literally decades, documentary editors, people who work with 18th century documents, have collected those papers and published them. And so that hadn't been done for Dickinson. So people just kind of kept repeating the same myths and over and over and over. And so when I started working on him and I wrote my first book, and I just realized, oh my goodness, how many things this man had written, I thought, well, somebody ought to collect those papers and publish them. And then the NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities, approached me about doing an edition, and I wasn't interested because being a documentary editor is really, really hard. And I was just like, I'm a historian, strictly, I don't do that. But then it just became so clear that it needed to be done, and I guess I had to be the one to do it. So I founded the John Dickinson Writings Project, and it took us a long time to get started, about 10 years before we got enough funding to hire a staff. But then starting in 2020, we started producing volumes, and we have now finished 4 volumes. 3 are published. The next volume 4 will be out in February, and we're working on volumes 5 and 6, which take us right into the 250th documents in 1775 and 1776. But unfortunately, the federal agencies can be very fickle with their funding. And our recent application for funding was denied by the NEH. And this is a devastating blow to the project. It means that if we don't find funding by September 30th, the project will stop. And the reasons we got for the denial were not great. It was, one hostile reviewer who sort of poisoned the panel against us, and one of them even said, do we really need another edition of Founders Papers? And as though they're sort of all the same and they're all saying the same thing. And Dickinson was unique. His thoughts, his ideas, his proposals were unique and powerful and important. And so, we're in a tricky situation, but, I hope my biography of him shows, I mean, I could not have written that without the John Dickinson Writings Project, our work on that. And so if the biography is, if it's good, if it makes a convincing case for Dickinson, we need to continue this project because more people need to be working on Dickinson. And, we're almost halfway through with the project, and it would just be a shame for it to die now. So yes, so that's kind of why Dickinson is forgotten, and let's hope he doesn't go back to being forgotten.
Right. Well, I'm terribly sorry about this troubling development, and certainly an extremely important and worthy endeavor. So best of luck on that. So back to the book. So what were Dickinson's political views in his important pamphlet, as you had alluded to, Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania?
Yes, he wrote that after the Townsend Acts were passed, and he was very alarmed because the Americans had really resisted the Stamp Act from 1765, and so that was really a good strong resistance, maybe a little bit on the violent side, which he didn't like. But no one seemed very concerned about the Townsend Acts. And so he wrote this series of 12 letters, which he published in the newspapers beginning at the end of 1767 and into 68. And it was, his position was that Americans had rights and liberties that should be protected under the British Constitution and the respective colonial constitutions, and that Americans needed to understand these rights and they needed to defend these rights using peaceful means. And also, as he was, explaining, educating Americans about the rights and how to defend them, he also gave them a really important idea. He suggested to them that they had a distinct American identity that was apart from their British identity. They were British, they were Britons, but they were also, and maybe more importantly, Americans. And this was a new idea. And it really, his farmers' letters turned him into an international celebrity, and everybody, around the Atlantic world, as far away as Poland, saw him as the spokesman for the American cause. And that's why he became so popular and so powerful. And so it was really about teaching Americans, ordinary Americans, how to resist rights using peaceful means of resistance.
Right. So important. And man, I could talk about the pamphlet, the essay all day. So something else you alluded to that really struck my interest. What were his complex views about independence in 1775, 1776, as radicals like John Adams are pushing independence forward? And of course, he wrote the Olive Branch Petition and eventually did oppose the Declaration of Independence.
So yes, it's a great question. I will suggest that his views about independence were actually quite simple. He didn't want it.
Okay.
What was complex were sort of his reasons and how he went about resisting independence. So his reasons were that well, America was in no way ready for independence. That was sort of the big thing. Even until like the eve of independence, we had no constitution, we had no government, we had no manufacturers, we couldn't make arms or ammunition. We were going up. We would be going up against the most powerful country in the world, and with it was just very, very precarious. So he really, and he also thought that the Pennsylvania Constitution, which existed under the British Constitution, was what protected the unique religious liberty of people in Pennsylvania. And so he really cared about that first and foremost. So that's those are the reasons he didn't want independence. And his way of trying to but resist the British, which of course he was the leader of the resistance to Britain, without going as far as independence, was he had basically a four-pronged approach. And this is from the summer of 1775, when the Second Continental Congress met. And at this point, nobody was pushing independence yet. And he put forth this program of resistance and reconciliation. The first element was petitioning. So, he drafted the Olive Branch Petition, which was a humble supplication to the crown to protect them from the rapacious ministers, who were taxing them unfairly. Very humble, mentioned no rights, didn't mention any grievances, just pled for protection. The second prong was the Declaration on the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. Now, Thomas Jefferson took credit for this, and he did write the first draft. But Dickinson came along and said, no, this is not sufficient. It's not belligerent enough. And he basically sort of, angried it up. He made it bellicose and hostile and saber rattling. And so he wrote this thing. And the idea behind that declaration was to instill fear in the British that if they came over and attacked us, we would beat them. And it was all bluster and bluff, because we didn't even have, really an army at that point. But his idea was that we would secure our rights and prevent war by, basically being, as scary as possible. And it also had the effect of, really raising the patriot spirit in the new Continental Army. It was read to them to great huzzas. And then the third approach was sending agents to negotiate. That one never actually came to fruition. Then he had a fourth approach that we only recently learned about. Some new documents in London have surfaced, and they were letters to David Berkeley, who was a banker and a Quaker abolitionist, and Dickinson was close with him and wrote to him. And when he wrote to Berkeley, he included a piece, a draft bill, a draft piece of legislation that Dickinson wrote, and he hoped that Berkeley could take this piece of draft legislation and slip it to someone in Parliament, and Parliament would pass it. And it was legislation to protect the colonies, and it was very deftly written so that it would appear to give the colonies what they wanted, and it would appear to give the British what they wanted. And Dickinson did this unbeknownst to Congress. And this was very typical of Dickinson, to sort of work behind the scenes and try. And many different legislative bodies, he got legislation passed when he wasn't a sitting member. So this was just another way that he worked. He was a master strategist, and that really comes through in all of his work here. So anyway, yes, that was his plan. And clearly that kind of fell apart when the Olive Branch Petition was, they didn't even read it. The king just rejected it without looking at it. And but Dickinson continued, really until the eve of independence, speaking against the Declaration of Independence before the big vote. But it's very crucial to know that when he knew the vote was going to go forward, he thought it should be unanimous. So he stepped aside and he stopped obstructing it, and he let it pass, like, by removing his objection. And then when it passed, he immediately led his battalion as a colonel to the front to face the British. And then after that, he enlisted as a private in the Delaware militia. No other founder did that. And he was one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in the country. He was supposed to be an officer, not a private, but he enlisted as a private to actually carry a weapon, and so thereby showed his patriotism.
Right. Sounds like a statesmanship that's prudential, that's courageous, that's yeah, but principled as well. So yeah, no, just more reasons to like him even more. So as a follow-up question, so his opposition to the Declaration to independence, is this where we get primarily the reputation for him being a quote unquote conservative?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, so there's been a lot of confusion in what little scholarship has happened on Dickinson. And, so, radical, moderate, conservative, all this thing, and none of that really makes sense, especially, applying, modern contemporary labels to an 18th century figure. It's tempting to do, but the terms don't map on to the 18th century. So people like to think he's a conservative because, and yes, in a sense, small c conservative, he wanted to conserve the relationship with Great Britain. So, okay, fine. But, the person who really is like the first conservative was Edmund Burke. And he earned his conservative credentials by opposing the French Revolution. Now, Dickinson, people have called him the American Burke, which completely does not work because Dickinson was a supporter of the French Revolution. The reason he did not want the American Revolution, but did think the French Revolution was okay, was that in America, we had the British Constitution as a protection. We could resort to that. The French did not have any such constitutional protections. And so they were engaging in just pure self-defense. And Dickinson was always, always an advocate for self-defense and a huge proponent of citizen militias. So even in spite of he was a fellow traveler with the Quakers, which accounts for a lot of his pacifist rhetoric, but he was not a pacifist himself. He was not a Quaker formally, just sort of, by association.
Right, gotcha. So, moving
Oh,
forward,
sorry.
yeah,
Sorry. Can I say a word about moderate as well?
yeah, please do.
So that is also a misnomer, I believe. And people like to, I think moderation, as a political principle is a good thing. It lends, it leads to compromises that we absolutely need. But I think it's a mistake when applied to Dickinson, and people who want to sort of tout him as a moderate don't really understand him or his politics. So just as he had some kind of, small c conservative credentials in wanting to, preserve the relationship with Britain. Yes, he appears as a moderate, but that's really only a superficial view. Dickinson was actually politically a radical. He was a radical who used moderate means. So his political principles were, when I say radical, what I mean is that, he advocated rights for the, populations apart from just the, property owning white men. He wanted rights for women. He wanted rights, freedom for Black people, and other things that his colleagues just outright rejected. And but he pursued these things using these peaceful measures, and this is exactly what Quakers did: agitated for religious liberty, also something his colleagues rejected, and wanting religious liberty for dissenters, a radical position, but advocating those through peaceful means that preserved the constitutional unity. So to see him as a moderate, it's a superficial view. It just sort of signals a lack of deep understanding about what Dickinson was about.
Right, gotcha. So he's one of the drafters of the Articles of Confederation, but also comes, quickly in the early 1780s to recognize some of the failures of the Articles to govern the nation effectively in the 1780s. So, what might account for that seeming paradox?
Yeah, well, so he did write the first draft of the Articles of Confederation in June 1776. And and he wrote in some really interesting provisions, a strong central government, like front and center was an extensive religious liberty toleration clause that would like basically freeze protections for religious dissenters at where they were in all the colonies, so that even if they didn't gain more religious liberty, at least they wouldn't lose any. And that's where he wrote in protections for women's religious liberty and also women's freedom of public speech. Really, truly radical, revolutionary provisions. But all of that, almost all of those types of provisions that Dickinson wrote into that draft were excised. So the version that passed, that was written, redrafted, rewritten in 1777, and passed, ratified in 1781, bore almost no resemblance to the articles that Dickinson had written. So when he signed, ratified the articles for Delaware, he said even at that point, like, and this was in 1779, he was like, these things need to change. And he became sort of a constant, from that point on, saying like, these are insufficient, they're not working, we need to do something better. So he was always sort of, opposed to them and wanting some kind of reform.
Right, right. And attends the Annapolis Convention, right? And so what are his what are his contributions to the Constitutional Convention and to the ratification of the document?
Yeah, so that's a huge topic. I'll just give you kind of, sort of the quickest little summary. I would say there are kind of two main contributions he made. There were lots of other ones, but the big one was that he was the person who proposed the solution for the problem of representation in Congress. He was the person who proposed that there should be proportional representation in one body and equal representation in the other body. And he gave the convention a metaphor to understand his idea. He said that the federal government will be like the sun, and the planets will be, or the states will be like the planets revolving the sun. But he proposed this like 2 or 3 times, and his colleagues just didn't listen to him. And I think part of the problem was that he was quite ill for most of the convention, and his speaking was not what it usually was. And so they just kind of ignored him until the committee met, and then they came back around and ended up adopting his idea, and we now call that the Connecticut Compromise, but it was Dickinson's idea. So that was the first thing. And the other thing was that he did his best to try to limit slavery in the Constitution. He was the one who put forth the motion to end the slave trade in 1808, and he was the person who basically got the language changed in the Fugitive Slave Clause that basically did not sort of endorse the legitimacy of slavery laws in the states. And so he also spoke out against the 3/5 compromise. And so he did his best. He pushed back against it, but obviously, again, his colleagues didn't listen.
Right. Well, that leads me to my next question. And so what were his views, his words, but more importantly, his actions regarding slavery and emancipation, personally, but also as a public official, which you just mentioned a few?
So we have evidence that he disliked slavery very much since he was a young man, and he disliked it for the damage that it did to both white people and Black people. It oppressed Black people, and it turned white people into tyrants, and also it made white people sycophants and people who did not understand equality and would grovel before their superiors and tyrannize their inferiors, because there was a hierarchy a social hierarchy at the time. But then he didn't really start speaking out against slavery until after he got married, and his wife was a very, very serious Quaker, and Quakers were the first abolitionists. And so early in the 1770s, we start seeing hints that he's kind of dropping in his public writings, where he's opposing the idea that slavery laws are legitimate. And so he starts that with that. And then after the Declaration of Independence, at the soonest opportunity that he had, he went home and wrote a manumission deed to conditionally free all of the people that he enslaved. And then before 10 years had passed, his conscience bothered him so much about it that in 1781, he freed some enslaved people unconditionally. And then by 1786, he had freed all of the people that he had held in bondage unconditionally. And then even before then, he actually started working on a larger scale for abolition. He wrote an abolition bill for the state of Delaware, and he tried at least twice to get that passed and failed both times. And then when he was president of the Delaware Constitutional Convention, he tried, he wanted to get slavery abolished in the Constitution, but it just wasn't going to happen. And so he tried to limit it. But yeah, it just, there's only so much he could do. And of course, Delaware didn't even, ratify the 13th Amendment that freed the slaves until I think like 1901, I think, somewhere in the very early 20th century. So, Delawareans were not like really, staunch abolitionists themselves.
And how many enslaved people did he hold in bondage?
We don't know the exact numbers.
Okay.
He inherited them from his father, and the people at the John Dickinson plantation, just outside of Dover, they're doing really great work on the enslaved people there. But I think it could have been as many as 130. It could have been less, but yeah, I think that I don't think he actually, it's hard to know. I don't know that he even had any enslaved people in his immediate household when he was living in Philadelphia. I'm not positive about that. It's hard to know. They don't come up a lot. But I don't think it was more than about 130 at a time.
Right, which but is a significant number, right?
Yes, yes.
And that he manumitted them, and as you point out in the book, at a great personal cost to himself.
Yes, I mean, I think I estimated it was over $1 million in today's money. And he was, it's true, he was one of the largest enslavers in Delaware. But yes, he took a huge financial hit for that. And, so 10,000 pounds in that era, over $1 million, I think $1.5 million maybe in today's money. But he was very pleased that, after all was said and done, he actually became wealthier, and he sort of took that as a sign from God that like he had done the right thing. So yeah.
Right, and one more quick follow-up is really intriguing. So is he guided like in a combination maybe of his Quaker principles and the principles of the founding that he's continually espousing for over a decade or two?
Yes, absolutely. There was really, Dickinson was influenced by all of the same, thinkers and writers as the rest of the founders, the Commonwealth tradition and European political thought, Machiavelli and Montesquieu and all the same people. And he was one of the leading legal minds, so he had all of the English and British jurists to draw from. And also, he was a great lover of literature, Shakespeare and Don Quixote and, all of the poetry. He loved poetry, and he even wrote some himself. And so he was drawing from everything, but, core to his life was Quakerism, the Bible. Even like when he was arguing cases in court, he would even, draw from the Bible, quote from the Bible, or, biblical fables and Aesop's fables, for example. He just sort of mixed everything in there. But the older he got, the more closely he hewed to Quakerism, so much so that even some of his closest friends mistook him for a Quaker. He dressed plainly. He used the plain speech, which is to say thee and thou. He used the plain dating system, so numbers and not, the pagan months and days of the week. But he never would become an actual member of the Society of Friends because he believed in, as he put it, the lawfulness of defensive war. So a people was always, God said that a people could defend themselves against attack. So he believed that very firmly, so he could never fully unite with Quakers.
Fascinating. So, in a nutshell, how did John Dickinson consistently support Republican ideals during the American Revolution and founding? A huge question, but in a nutshell, to wrap us up.
Yeah, so I think that it was, to get it down to the most basic elements, he cared deeply about the rights of all people. He was sort of a early proponent of human rights, whereas other people were talking about rights of Englishmen, rights of man. Dickinson was talking about the rights of all people. There was a Quaker thing, and so bringing ordinary people into the discussion of, like, with his Fabius letters, which he wrote to advocate the ratification of the Constitution, bringing in ordinary people and saying everybody has not just a right but a duty to engage in public deliberations, and then wanting to make sure that those rights were protected, both well, through a myriad ways, but through governmental structures, and through good, sort of morally upright Republicans, with a small r, Republican behavior, that people should be, monitoring and governing themselves as individuals so that they could then responsibly govern themselves as a people. And so he was just about, advocating those principles and then trying to put in place structures that would protect, and facilitate those principles. And he did that from the time he was, a young man in his legal training in London and wanting to, defend the innocent and the injured, and then as a legislator writing legislation that would protect people, and then all the way through to his advocacy as, as a private citizen for civic education, religion and science education, very tightly woven together, not opposed as they are today. He believed that science was a way to know God. And so, binding these things together to make good, informed citizens who could make good, good decisions for their country. So that's what he did his entire life.
Sounds like a good example for us all today. So that's a great way to sum that up. Well, Jane, thank you very, very much for joining me today on this very important topic, on this fascinating figure, John Dickinson, and sharing your newest book. Good luck on the Washington Book Prize, and also on the critically important funding for the John Dickinson Writings Project.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
All right, thanks. And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out the other interviews in our America 250 series on our channel, and go ahead and click subscribe.